Thank you very much for accepting my invitation for this conversation. My first question is concerned with your research focus. So you focus mainly on curriculum debates and African higher education. How did you get interested in this topic?
So I started my PhD around the South African fees must fall, roads must fall kind of movement time. And I think that had a big influence on the choice to focus on decolonization debates in higher education in South Africa. And specifically, I think I was trying to understand what were the epistemological concerns within the whole decolonization debate. And I was trying to understand what is meant really by this idea that knowledge and power are very intricately related in the context of South African universities. So, yeah, that was kind of the motivating factor. I was trying to understand what was happening at that time within universities and why I hadn't heard that idea of knowledge and power very much in the context of having studied epistemology and philosophy, for example.
Yeah, thank you. And during your fellowship now, you will also co-organize a workshop on curriculum transformation, which is somehow related. So what are the issues or questions that you will be dealing with in the framework of the workshop?
So I think one thing is maybe to look at examples from all over the world of curriculum transformation within philosophy, kind of context, what other departments have done to de-Westernize or to diversify or to decolonize their curricula. We will also want to think about what that means on a sort of principled theoretical debate level. And I am also particularly interested to think in that context about insights from curriculum experts on how curricula change, or what are the principles to think about when you are changing the curriculum. Because, I mean, disciplines all have canons and knowledge that they consider to be fundamental to that discipline. So what does that mean when you are calling for curricula to change? How does that shift what's considered, for example, fundamental, and what are the principles of making that change in a systematic way?
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning the protests in South Africa is also driving your research interest in this way. Have these protests led to curriculum change, especially also in philosophy departments in South Africa?
I think, yes, they definitely has been changes to the curriculum, changes to the institution more broadly. But, 2025 was actually 10 years since the student protest. So there's been a lot of literature or scholarships or public lectures even that are reflecting on how far what has happened since then. And one thing is that there's varied, the decolonization movements have had varied impact on change depending on universities, depending on disciplines, depending on people. So lecturers, who makes up the different departments and so on. And one key finding, so there's a book by Jonathan Jansen, and I can't remember the first name of this person, but their surname is Walters. Came out in 2022, so a bit before the 10 years on, but it was trying to reflect on this question of change and what had happened after. And one of the big sort of finding, or, well, there are findings and then there's the argument that they were making, but the argument was that what was a key sort of result or finding was that universities were quite open to this in a way. I mean, they weren't initially open. Students were met with bullets and so on and so on. But somehow the institutions managed to absorb the whole decolonization thing, and it became quite a normal part of like universities. And Jansen and Walters argue that this is, in a way, this institutionalization of this call for radical change might have tamed what would have been a radical idea that's calling for something radical. So that's one thing. But in terms of more tangible, practical findings, I mean, people implemented it and heard it differently. So there were findings that different lecturers might have not understood what it meant. There were varied understandings of what decolonizing mean, and it varied from including maybe a more diverse reading list, taking students more seriously, so like a pedagogical change in classroom dynamics. And there aren't yet very good, consistent examples of a more systematic approach to decolonization. And with philosophy specifically, I don't think the book spoke about philosophy departments, but yeah, there's been variation in how people implement it.
Another aspect of your research is a paper or also work you have done on post-comparative philosophy. And you discussed it as having potential and or limited potential for African philosophy at the current state. So could you maybe briefly introduce the post-comparative approach in philosophy and how it could be made fruitful in an African context?
So I think post-comparative philosophy, as I understood it, is an approach to how we do intercultural philosophy. And it's maybe responding to a very comparison or comparative-based approach where we say, oh, this idea in Western philosophy is better than that idea, or we say Indian metaphysics is better than African metaphysics, for example. So a sort of comparison in that sense. And that's one element. The second element of the post-comparative approach, as I understood it, was proposing an alternative way to do intercultural philosophy, which is this sort of global fusion sort of like approach to a variety of traditions. So you don't necessarily take this comparative approach, but you, as a philosopher or as a thinker, allow yourself to openly borrow from whatever different traditions are available and accessible to you to answer particular philosophical questions. Now, I think as an approach for doing intercultural philosophy, that's a cool idea. But in the context of critiques of Eurocentrism, my one worry was the different traditions in philosophy have received different levels of attention. And when they've received attention, the nature of that attention has differed. So if we take African philosophy, for example, my one concern was to think about, well, what is the agenda according to African philosophers themselves? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to and it's a question of priority. I think you can do both, but it was a question of priority whether and what the place is for developing African philosophy on its own terms, right? In the sense in which Western philosophy is rich because we've been working on it and has received this attention over years. Maybe similar things could be said for Indian philosophy and some Asian traditions. And I just was wondering, African philosophy, how much formal attention and academic attention is needed for post-comparative kind of work to take place on a sort of equal, maybe not equal footing, but with a tradition that's very rich and diverse and comprehensive. So I thought that African philosophy or African philosophers would have to juggle these two things, right? On the one hand, post-comparative studies is, you want to engage with other traditions, you want to borrow freely and so on. But if the African philosophy tradition hasn't had the sort of expansion that other traditions might have had, the question was whether that needs to be a priority. In a way that it's not a priority, for example, for Western philosophy, and what that meant for intercultural philosophy.
Yes, and in the paper you mentioned the need to develop robust and rich philosophical resources, and I definitely agree that there's a tension, right, in between the borrowing and the not knowing yet what is. Now, during your fellowship here at Hildesheim University, you're working with philosophical sources in Sesotho, which is your first language. And could you elaborate on the role Sesotho played so far in your education and philosophical training?
Yeah, in my philosophical training, it hasn't played any role. But I have throughout my basic education, so primary and high school, I have done Sesotho as a language, as a subject, as one of my subjects. But all my education obviously was English medium. Actually, not true. My primary school, a large portion of it was Afrikaans medium. So I haven't had experience with Sesotho in a very formalized educational setting, except as a subject when I was in high school and primary. And right now, in my position here at Lofi, part of what I'm doing is trying to look at Sesotho sources. And so I'm trying to think about, I wouldn't say I'm trying to do philosophy in Sesotho, but to think about what would be philosophically interesting or interesting for philosophizing, given the Sesotho language and culture. So very groundwork kind of work that I'm trying to do.
Could you give examples of sources of philosophizing in Sesotho that you are dealing with?
Yeah, so the obvious ones are, I'm mainly working with text and oral tradition. Well, oral orality is a big part of like African traditions. But so far I've been, and I think I will continue to be more focused on texts, just because practically it offers like a medium to go back to and to be able to share with everybody. So I'm working with Proverbs, my ele. I am looking at potentially some novels, which might be written in Sesotho or English that touch on the Sesotho language or the Sesotho culture. I will also look at Lerato, which are riddles. And what I'm realizing is that Sesotho is it's like an umbrella language. So you get Northern Sesotho and Southern Sesotho, and I'm more fluent. My mother tongue is in Southern Sesotho, so the Sesotho is spoken in parts of Johannesburg, parts of South Africa, and Lesotho. But you can also get Setswana, which is very much in the Sesotho family, and you can get Sepedi, which is in the northern Sesotho kind of camp. And then I think I might also look at poetry. So I am looking at praise poetry for kings, but the language in there is not very everyday speech kind of vocab. So that should be fun and interesting. But I think it will be, from what I can tell, especially if you're thinking concepts of peace, of courage, I think that's a really nice place to try and extract something of philosophies or material for philosophizing about what we might want to call a sort of perspective on something.
During your research so far, have you found anything where you say, well, this really struck me, or this philosophical idea is very interesting and I would like to explore it further?
Actually, a lot of things the experience has been striking itself because, like I said, I don't interact with Sesotho in a formal academic setting at all. And this isn't a sore point or a happy point, it just is. But starting this work has been exciting for exposing my limitations when it comes to the language. So just reading it is painfully slow. So that's been striking. But I was going through the praise poetry, and in the book that I have, I forget. This is new to me, so I don't have the names of the authors readily in mind. But in the praise poetry, the introduction to that, the praise poetry for Basotho kings, was very striking in its emphasis on courage. And I was taken back to my obsession with courage as one of the core virtues. And it felt kind of weird because I had done my master's on the virtue of courage from Plato's perspective. So something about the focus on courage was really striking. And I think maybe, depending on what I find, that might be virtue theory, or like a focus on like character, especially with the virtues of, what do you call them? Warriors, or like that group of people in leadership and things might be a prominent feature of what comes out of my work. We'll see, because like I said, the praise poetry is quite difficult to access from a language perspective, to be able to extract the meanings and so on. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.